Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Youth Matters. Now, in today's show, we are discussing gangs and guns and how it's impacted our young in our community. And in today's second segment, we will be speaking to professionals to find out their perspective on the topic of discussion. আজকে আমরা ডিসকাশন আমরা করলাম হইলো আমরা ইয়াং ভাই বোনেন তারা ইনভলভমেন্ট গ্যাংস লগে তারা খেনে দল বান্ধিয়া তারা বুঝইন ফ্যামিলির সারিয়া আখতা ফ্রেন্ডাইন তো লগে না তাকিয়া গ্রুপ বান্ধিয়া চলাফেরা করতা একটা খেনে করেন তারা একটা তারার পড়ালেখাত কিলা এফেক্ট করে তারা ফ্যামিলির লগে লাইফ কিলা এফেক্ট করে ওটা আমরা আজকে একটা জানতাম চাইলাম আমরা তিনজন প্রফেশনাল আইসন তারা তিনজন ডিফারেন্ট ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড থাকি তারা আমরা লগে মাতবা আমরা তোরা বুঝ দিবা খিলা সাইকোলজি একটা ওয়ার্ক হয় আর খিলা এফেক্ট করে আমরা ইয়াং মানুষরে Abdul Rahman, welcome to the show. Abdul Rahim, brother. Now, we had a caller who was talking about the terminology gangs and whether it's actually right to even use such a term. Mashallah, you work in the youth sector with young people. What is your take on that?
Bismillah. From my point of view, my personal and sort of professional point of view, I think we need to be responsible. And the thing about the word gang is, language conveys a lot of meaning. And I suppose for me, the term is highly problematic. When we use it, the implications it has for the way young people are perceived, the type of services they might receive, how they're approached by adults, how they're understood by society. There's lots and lots of implications. So what I would say is we need to be responsible and we need to qualify what we mean.
So I get the Oxford Dictionary refers to the term gang as a group of young people, and I guess an organized group of peoples or a group of young people involved in petty crime or violence. So if that's what's written in the dictionary, then I guess the common person, the average person, would refer to a group who meet that description as a gang. If it's not gang,
not necessarily. I mean, academics and policymakers have been debating the definition for many years, and if you were to open any basic textbook on criminology or the subject, you would find that would be what has been addressed. So I wouldn't just take the Oxford Dictionary definition. For starters, it's not necessarily just young people that are involved in offending as part of a group. Simple as that. It's highly contested amongst academics. I think the issue for me is, and from a point of view where we're delivering services, when you say this person is involved in a gang and so on and so forth, it doesn't really tell you very much at all. As far as what type of help we want to provide, what sort of services, really it muddies the water more than it clarifies matters.
Okay, thank you. Sajib, you're working in a school setting. What is your experience of working with students who might be affiliated with gangs, or what's your take on this?
Well, coming on to that point about the term gang, and I think the kids who were on before, they were talking about having a group of people. You might not be doing anything criminal or anything with intent or disturbing, the peace of the area. Then
sure.
that should be fine. But from my point of view as a teacher, we do have sort of sessions to raise awareness about this kind of area to do with gangs. I myself.
And what is the term that's normally used?
Well, I mean, the term gangs is used because that's the common term used to talk about youth. But I mean, that term just means a group of people. So you can have a group of teachers outside, and they could be called a gang.
Are you trying to make the teachers sound a bit more funky than they are?
The word means group of people. If they're not doing anything criminal, if they're not disturbing the peace of the area, or they're not, scaring anyone, then that's just a group of people. And I think that's what the term gang should mean. But we associate criminal activity with gangs, and I think that's the term we're trying to convey here. That's what we mean by gangs.
Okay, thank you. Sidra, you're a clinical psychologist. What is it that makes our young people join gangs?
I guess what we're talking about today are criminal gangs. So gangs, there are many different types of groups and gangs, whatever you want to call them. And I completely agree with the other two guest speakers that we mustn't pathologize young people. Because, if you pathologize a group of people, they're more likely to engage in antisocial behavior. And if you're already believing that they are somehow behaving in a way that's antisocial, even if they are not, they're more likely to then go ahead and engage in those behaviors. But I guess in terms of what causes young people to join gangs, you know, there's so many different levels, conscious and unconscious factors that drive young people to join criminal gangs. And I'm going to refer to this as criminal gangs, particularly as my experience has been working with young people who have been part of very, very dangerous criminal gangs, who have gone on to carrying out quite horrific crimes. So in terms of...
Why is it that, what is it that appeals to them to want to join such delinquent groups?
So on a conscious level, young people are looking for identity, confirmation, validation. They're looking for a position in society. So a gang looks very appealing because actually in the gang they see that they can make quick money, they can receive some sort of street cred, they can have a sense of identity, which is not actually you're at school, you're not achieving very much, you're not doing very well. The narrative, that the things that they're told at home often might be actually you're not very good, you're useless, you're not worthy. At school they might be hearing very negative feedbacks about themselves, such as actually you're not much of an achiever. So where do they go to find some kind of sense of personal achievement? And gangs can be initially a very attractive choice for young people. And often remember, people are not joining gangs consciously knowing that this is what's going to happen, this is what's expected of them. Often they join a gang because actually they're not quite aware long term they're going to have do certain things in a gang to remain as part of the gang.
Okay, thank you for that. Abdul Rahim, I guess, you know, we're talking about the terminology as well. It's when you obviously look at the definition of gangs, the term delinquent behaviour comes in as well, and I guess it's that which gives it that negative connotation to the term gang. In terms of when you're part of a group that's committing delinquent acts, much appears to be without financial benefit, like say for example vandalism. So what else motivates them? Sidra has spoken about it in terms of lacking identity and so forth, you know, from your day-to-day work.
I think the issue needs to be understood in context, and that being a sort of political context, a social context, economic context, and you know the way that young people are trying to navigate day-to-day life. They operate in many interlinking systems. So whilst there may be some drivers that young people are more conscious of, there are also factors that they may be less. So, you know, if you have a society like ours that is, in my opinion, an organising principle of this society is racism and systemic white supremacy. If you've got that as an underlying principle that organises your society, and then you have young people, and not just young people, but young people that then grow into adults, trying to find a way in society and a place in that society, and that society has a context that is inflected by hundreds of years of colonialism and slavery, that impacts a intergenerational experience of trauma. You have young people growing up in that reality now and trying to find their place, like the sisters talking about, sort of being validated, trying to find your identity, but also trying to work with that day-to-day racism, that day-to-day white supremacy, the trauma, the violence, and being marginalised in the society that you're meant to be part of. Okay. And I would argue that that's a much often neglected position.
Sajib, in terms of when you work in a school setting, do you hear about rival groups of delinquents having, problems with one another? Do you get that kind of street culture coming into the schools, and do you hear about that?
Well, the interesting thing there to talk about is that the majority of our youth are not nowhere near involved in or into or attracted to gangs. But the small minority that are having a bigger impact in those communities than the ones that aren't interested in the gangs. So there are actually very few that sort of get into the schools and actually have that influence around the other kids. So I personally have had stories about gangs involved in schools that are quite close together. So for example, in Tower Hamlets, you have a lot of schools that are quite close together. And in that particular area, for example, a lot of the schools have a policy where the kids aren't allowed to go out for lunch, for example, because of the problems with rival schools and gangs kind of thing. You don't get that kind of problem outside of London, where the kids are sort of free to go out and they don't have that issue. So it seems to be regional-based kind of issues. And
where there's a lot of concentration of schools and children, they have that sort of impact in the area because of other schools in the nearby area. But
Sure.
yeah, that's all there is.
Sidra, sometimes we hear about reports, in 2007 in South London there were devastating stories that came out where 3 young people were killed by rival gangs. Now, what's really worrying from if we go by what we hear in the reports, children as young as 11 are joining gangs. What is, once again, why is it that more and more youngsters are getting involved with such delinquent groups?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is really worrying because we have, catastrophic events when young people join and are coerced sometimes into committing crimes. They are coerced into committing all sorts of things that they otherwise wouldn't be involved in. And young people, I mean, there's a system of recruiting people who wouldn't be quite as visible to the police as older gang members. So, for example, 11-year-old girls are a target. 10-year-old boys would be an easy target because actually they can be easily coerced to join a gang by showing certain incentives. And they can easily carry drugs, they can easily carry weapons, so they can be used as a tool for the gang members.
Okay. We have a caller on the line. Assalamu alaikum, caller. Assalamu alaikum, caller.
Walaikum salam.
Sister, how would you like to contribute to the discussion that we're having today?
So the question that I have for the panel is whether they think that mental health is a factor in why young people in the Bangladeshi community might be joining criminal gangs.
I think that's a really good question, Sister. Thank you. Abdul Rahim, Sister asks a very good question. We hear so many reports about mental health and how it impacts our young people. Is that a possible cause for why someone would join a delinquent group?
Absolutely. I mean, again, I have to say I think we do need to qualify the language, but I've made the point. Absolutely, mental health is an issue. Health generally, our health for young people, particularly across Muslim communities, is particularly poor. Our nutrition is particularly poor. Issues with childhood obesity is an issue, and equally mental health too. Like I just said, those kind of experiences of trauma. And this is one thing I think that we don't talk about very much. Those young people that are involved in these types of groups and this type of offending and behaviours where there's lots of exposure to violence and trauma, that invariably leads to acute levels of problematic mental health. So hypervigilance, stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, lots and lots of issues later on in life. And so what we see is massive overrepresentation of people of colour and Muslims in prisons and mental health institutions later on in life.
Sajid, you hear about often reports where weapons are being taken into schools. 20 years ago, we heard reports where people would be involved in violence with fists and sticks. Then 10 years back, we heard about knives. And now it seems to be that the use of guns seems to be very common in such altercations. What kind of weapons are being brought into schools, and what is your awareness of this?
Well, it definitely is a big worry at the moment. There has been a massive rise in the amount of guns that are in the streets at the moment. And I think what we were talking about earlier about young children being brought into gangs as young as 10 and 11, a lot of the times they're used for that purpose, to conceal weapons and to deliver weapons, and they might not be as suspicious as a target for police to stop and check and things like that. So I think gangs are getting a little bit more sort of not clever, but they're trying to think of new ways of trying to get an edge over other gangs and things like that. So
do you mind if
that's
I
the
just
problem.
comment? I have to say again, we have to be responsible. There's no evidence to suggest that there's a massive rise in the use of firearms or the carrying of firearms. We need to be really clear. If we're going to take the issue seriously, if we are as concerned about our young people in our communities as we say we are, we need to be specific about what the risks are. Yes, there's young people that are involved in violent offending. Offending across the country hasn't, as far as the Office for National Statistics is concerned, hasn't really changed. The number of young people carrying weapons has gone up, that's true. But the number of firearms isn't. And that is not to minimalise the difficulties in our community, it is not to minimalise the violence in our communities, it is not to minimalise the trauma. But if we're going to deal with this seriously, we need to be really clear about what is the circumstances, what are the facts, where is the evidence.
Okay, no, I think that's a very fair point. Sidra, we're talking about obviously gun crimes now, and a question that comes to mind straight away is, where do these young people find these guns? Where do they purchase them or get them from?
I think a real good question is how much a young person has been exposed to violence and weapons in the home. So if they have access to guns and weapons in the home, they are more likely to be habituated to seeing these weapons. So accessing them for them will be very easy. If they've grown up in a context where their fathers have been part of gangs, where their older brothers have been part of gangs, where other family members have been part of gangs and carried weapons, and somehow this young person has seen them as a role model, somehow looked up to them as a kind of sort of father figure or parent figure, then they're more likely to want to copy them. So they'll go out of their way, they'll go anywhere to find the guns if they want to find them.
Sure. Abdurrahim, let's assume that it's not role models at home who have used guns before.
Mm-hmm.
Where else would where would you find a gun? Where would you buy a gun from? Because obviously it's not like America where it's widely available.
No, and the answer is adults. So, again, we're talking about pathologizing young people, but the fact of the matter is that to get these kind of illegal items, whether it be guns, whether it be substances, ultimately it's adults that are able to bring those sort of things into the communities. And where there are specific neighbourhoods where there are these kind of challenges, usually there are 1 or 2 guns floating around, and young people do know about them and where they are, but they're not as prevalent as we imagine they might be. Mm-hmm. That is not to say that they're not. Again, it should be taken very, very seriously. But young people who are involved in some of those behaviours know where to find them.
Sure. About 2 weeks ago, I heard reports that in Stepney, which
Mm-hmm.
is very close to home, there were shootings that took place and our youths were involved.
A firearm was discharged. Yeah, that's my understanding.
So I guess it comes back to where would they have obtained such a weapon, and secondly, with your experience of working with young people. Has it always been, we used to hear about knife crimes, and that was on the up. Why is it that, more and more people are talking about gun crimes and not knife crimes? Is it that it's now old-fashioned and people don't use it?
I think people are still very concerned about young people using knives. Personally, I'm of the perspective that the tool doesn't matter so much. If you're willing to harm someone, if you're going to use a knife or a gun, that's the tool that's being used. And if we're going to make any kind of impact on young people, then we need to address why they would want to use those things in the first place. We could get rid of all the knives, but there'd always be another implement that they could pick up. We need to work on why young people feel such a way that they need to harm one another.
Sajib, leads on to the question, why is it that our young people want to harm one another? What is it that would result in them actually trying to physically injure another person?
Well, there could be so many reasons for that, but a lot of the times it's like a
what would you say those reasons are? What kind of reasons would you put in?
It could start off something that's quite small, so maybe like it was a fight between one person and another person, and that can escalate. And what I end up hearing from stories from other from young people, not just young people, like adult gangs as well, is that they'll talk about how this happened. So what caused this incident? And then you could keep going back and back, and it would have started from something very simple or small, and it just escalates. And I think they probably feel as if, all right, we can't let something like that happen, so we need to, show a response, and it just carries on back and forth over and over again.
Sure.
So those kind of incidents where there's violence, it probably isn't one isolated incident. It's probably because of quite a long history of incidents.
I think the thing is as well, we live in a very violent society. So, we live in a society. There was a couple of interesting articles recently. Britain has been perpetually at war for 100 years. It's the only country in the world to do that, to be constantly at war. We're also the second largest manufacturer of weapons. So when we have a state, when we have a government, we have a society that, fair enough, in very different ways, is so intrinsically and historically involved in violence and the production of weapons and the supply of them all around the country, is it so unusual that the young people growing up in our society might be involved in violence and the distribution of weapons.
I'd like to add something to that.
Yeah,
It's about
please
a
do.
sense of safety. Young people carry guns because they want to feel safe on the streets. But there's two things here. One is actual risk. So there's real risk out there of them being attacked physically in other ways. But there's also a perceived safety, perceived risk out there. So a lot of young people in the youth offending teams that I've worked in, they overestimate the risk involved. So they slight paranoia. So they think that if there is a sort of 10% or 20% chance of them being attacked, in their minds they'll calculate that to be 95%. So that makes them heightened in terms of heightened anxiety. Sense of protection is to just increase. So really it's about their appraisal of risk as well as the actual risk.
Sure. Sidra, Albert K. Cohen, a criminologist and also a graduate from Harvard, in his book Delinquent Boys, Culture of the Gang, he talks about an impulse which is common in all people. And it's only those that don't have any social values that lead to committing such acts of delinquency. What's your view on that?
I think going back to what's already been said, it's so important not to pathologise young people when they're growing up. It's important not to see a group of 3 or 4 young lads and think actually they're part of a gang.
What I guess he's saying is it's almost inbuilt in all of us, but we choose not to do anything about it. Would you say that's a bit extreme in such a theory?
I think it's really important to take these issues very seriously, but at the same time, from a very early preventative stage, try as far as possible to reduce the chances of young people getting into gangs. And this means reducing the risk factors. And the risk factors, quite simply, are things like poverty, being from a family where they're not getting very much support, having role models where there's violence and aggression, which is actually part of the system. But actually something else which was talked about, organisational racism. There's lots of things out there systemically that's not helping young people sort of improve their sense of worth, self-worth. Because ultimately, if you can improve a young person's self-esteem, their confidence, their self-worth, then really you're deterring them from going into antisocial gangs. You'll help them, the idea is to help them to join pro-social groups of people and communities.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much. Now, that's the end of our second segment. In our last segment, we will be looking at solutions. So if we are aware of young people who are involved with such delinquent groups, or we know people who might be influenced by such groups, how do we protect them? And Sidra spoke about preventative measures and so forth, and that's what we'll be looking at in the third segment. Alhamdulillah, আমরা আজকে ডিসকাশন করছি আমরা প্রবলেম কি তো ইয়াজার আমরা ভাই বোন ইয়াং ভাই বোন তারা গ্রুপ লগে মিলিয়া কত জিনিস করা আছে একটা বালানা একটা খরো ইলিগুলো হইতে পারে সো আমরা থার্ড পার্টও লাস্ট পার্টও আমরা ডিসকাশন করবো কিলা আমরা ভাই বোন তোরে সাহায্য করা যায় কিতা করলে আমরা হুরুতাইন তারা গিয়ে গ্যাঙ্গ গিয়া হামাইতা নাই সো আপনারা আমরা লগে থাকবা ইনশাআল্লাহ আসসালামু আলাইকুম